The bell above the shop door chimed as 9-year-old Jamal stepped into Mr. Davis's corner store. The familiar scent of bread and candy filled the air, and Jamal smiled, clutching his allowance tightly. His eyes scanned the shelves, but his focus quickly landed on the glass counter, where rows of chocolate bars sat neatly displayed. It was his favorite part of the week, choosing a treat after a long week of school. Today, he had his heart set on the caramel-filled bar in the middle. With a grin on his face, Jamal approached the counter, pointing at it eagerly. "Can I have that one, please?" Mr. Davis, an elderly man with graying hair and a permanent frown, looked at Jamal with a strange expression. His eyes darted from the chocolate to Jamal, and his face twisted with concern. He leaned forward slightly, shaking his head. "I can't sell that to you, son," Mr. Davis said, his voice low and serious. Jamal frowned in confusion. "Why not? I've got the money," he replied, holding up his small fistful of coins. The shopkeeper shifted nervously behind the counter. "It's for your own good," Mr. Davis said, glancing nervously at Jamal's hands. "I don't want you to hurt yourself." "Hurt myself?" Jamal repeated, his brow furrowed. He had no idea what Mr. Davis was talking about. "How would I hurt myself with a chocolate bar?" Mr. Davis sighed heavily, clearly uncomfortable. "Look, I'm just worried you might get confused is all." "Confused?" Jamal blinked. "About what?" Mr. Davis's eyes dropped to Jamal's hands again, and then he cleared his throat. "You're the same color as that chocolate, son. What if you start eating it, and you get confused and bite your own fingers off?" For a moment, Jamal stood frozen, unsure if he had heard the man correctly. His heart sank as the words sunk in. He stared at Mr. Davis, stunned. "You think I'd bite my own fingers off?" Jamal asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "Because I'm the same color as the chocolate?" Mr. Davis nodded slowly, as if his concern were genuine, as if he were doing Jamal a favor. "It's for your own safety, you understand. I wouldn't want you to mistake your fingers for the chocolate." Jamal's mouth went dry. He couldn't believe what he was hearing. "But I'm not stupid," he stammered, trying to make sense of it. "I know the difference between my skin and a chocolate bar." The shopkeeper waved his hand dismissively. "I'm just trying to help. You might not even realize it until it's too late. Better to be safe than sorry, right?" Jamal felt heat rising in his cheeks. It wasn't just confusion anymore. It was anger. He'd been coming to this shop for years, ever since he was old enough to walk here on his own. Never once had anyone treated him like this. Never once had Mr. Davis said anything like this to the other kids. "I don't need your help," Jamal said, his voice shaking. "I just want to buy the chocolate. I have money. I'm not going to bite my fingers off." But Mr. Davis just shook his head again. "Sorry, kid. I can't risk it." Jamal's stomach twisted as a lump formed in his throat. He turned and rushed out of the store, the bell ringing sharply as he pushed through the door. Outside, the cool air hit his face, but it did little to calm him down. His fists clenched around the coins in his hand, and his mind raced with the ridiculousness of what had just happened. It wasn't the first time someone had treated him differently because of his skin color, but it was the first time someone had been so direct about it, so absurd. He'd never felt so humiliated, so small. When Jamal got home, he didn't say anything to his mom at first. He didn't want her to worry, didn't want to explain why he came home without the chocolate bar he'd been looking forward to all week. Instead, he went to his room and lay on his bed, staring at the ceiling, trying to make sense of the strange, hurtful encounter. But the next day, when his best friend Malik asked if he wanted to go to Mr. Davis's shop after school, Jamal couldn't hide it any longer. "I can't go back there," Jamal mumbled. Malik looked confused. "Why not? You love that place. Best candy in the neighborhood." Jamal hesitated, then sighed. "Mr. Davis wouldn't sell me anything yesterday," he admitted, glancing away. "He said he was afraid I'd bite my own fingers off." Malik blinked, baffled. "What? He thinks I'd get confused because I'm the same color as chocolate," Jamal muttered bitterly, the humiliation still fresh. "He wouldn't sell it to me." Malik's face twisted in shock, then outrage. "That's insane. He can't say stuff like that." Jamal shrugged, though his shoulders were tense. "I didn't know what to say. He acted like he was doing me a favor or something." Malik shook his head, pulling out his phone. "You can't let him get away with that. I'm telling my mom. This is messed up." Before Jamal could protest, Malik had already sent a text. Minutes later, Malik's mom, Mrs. Johnson, arrived at their school to pick them up. As soon as she heard what happened, her face darkened with anger. "He actually said that to you?" Mrs. Johnson asked, her voice shaking with disbelief. "He refused to sell you chocolate because of your skin?" Jamal nodded, embarrassed to admit it, but Mrs. Johnson wasn't having any of it. "We're going down there right now," she declared, her voice filled with righteous fury. "This isn't right." Jamal stood nervously behind Mrs. Johnson as they entered Mr. Davis's store. The bell above the door jingled, but this time the sound felt sharp and foreboding. Mr. Davis looked up from the counter, his face instantly hardening when he saw Jamal. "Back again?" Mr. Davis muttered. "What do you want?" Mrs. Johnson stepped forward, her expression fierce. "I want an explanation," she said, her voice low and dangerous. "Why did you refuse to sell chocolate to Jamal?" Mr. Davis crossed his arms, looking defensive. "I was just looking out for him. I didn't want the boy to hurt himself." "Hurt himself?" Mrs. Johnson scoffed, her voice rising. "You really think a child would confuse his fingers for chocolate? You think he doesn't know the difference?" Mr. Davis shrugged. "You never know. Better safe than sorry." Mrs. Johnson's eyes flashed with anger. "You're not keeping him safe. You're treating him like he's less than the other kids who come in here. Like he's not smart enough to know what chocolate is. That's racist." Mr. Davis's face turned red. "Racist? I'm not racist. I was just trying to help." "Help?" Mrs. Johnson shook her head, incredulous. "You humiliated him. You made him feel like he wasn't good enough to buy candy in your shop. That's not help. That's discrimination." More customers in the store had started to pay attention now, and the tension in the air was thick. Some whispered among themselves, and one woman in the back spoke up. "I heard what he said yesterday," she called out. "He refused to sell to that boy, and it was wrong." Mr. Davis glanced around, his anger growing as he realized people were turning against him. "Fine," he snapped. "Take your business elsewhere. I don't need your kind in my store." Mrs. Johnson shook her head in disgust. "Believe me, we will." She gently took Jamal's hand and led him out of the store, leaving Mr. Davis standing behind his counter, red-faced and seething. In the days that followed, word spread quickly about what Mr. Davis had said and done. People in the neighborhood were outraged, and soon, the store that had once been bustling with customers became eerily quiet. No one wanted to support a shopkeeper who would treat a child like Jamal so cruelly. Jamal, meanwhile, found comfort in the support of his friends, family, and community. Though the experience had shaken him, he realized that standing up for himself and speaking out against injustice was the right thing to do. As for Mr. Davis, his shop never quite recovered. And Jamal? He found a new place to buy his chocolate, one where he was treated with the respect he deserved. If you enjoyed this story, please consider subscribing to my YouTube channel. I put a lot of love and care into telling these important stories, and your support means the world to me. Thank you again, and I'll see you next time. Have a blessed day.